Hello and welcome to the Japan Politics Podcast, your source of Japanese news in English. And this week I'd like to talk about, in particular, the fact that Prime Minister Ishiba, who's been through a bit of a tough time himself, is now began talking tough. Now, he's talking tough on two issues. One, in his response to Trump's tariffs, and two, in response to his internal critics and sort of the challenges he's been under domestically and calls to lower the consumption tax. But first, I really want to dive into this Trump tariff response first. So, Ishiba, essentially, Japan has been facing the threat of Trump's tariffs for some time. I believe originally when they came in, the proposal that Trump was putting out there was that there would be 24 and 25% tariffs, or around that, both general tariffs and auto-specific tariffs that could affect Japan. Now, he's since lowered those, and at the time when this first happened, there was a lot of pressure on Ishiba, to get really tough on Trump and to sort of retaliate possibly or go for a WTO dispute. People like the person who finished second to him in the leadership election, Seinae Takeichi, was calling for sort of a tougher response to Trump. Now, initially, Ishiba wasn't doing any of that. He's taken sort of this middle ground of not antagonizing Trump, not sort of poking him with a stick and saying things to make him think he can't be trusted as an ally, or to make Trump see him like sort of antagonistically. But he also hasn't just rolled over and accepted it. And there's been ongoing news that there may be tariff talks between Japan and the USA to resolve this in a more long-term sense. But as I say, it's gone down now from that 24-25% tariff, and Ishiba might have been tempted to say, 10%, which I believe they're facing now, is better than 24-25. But he's talking tough in the sense he's saying that Japan cannot just accept these new tariffs as, it's better than 24-25. It's good enough. Good enough is the enemy of, adequate, good, excellent, to put words in his mouth. So he's basically saying all these new tariffs need to go, and they can't just accept 10% purely because it's lower than 24-25. They can't just accept it just because maybe they can live with it a bit more than 24-25. And he's holding firm in that sense, and I suppose he's giving his strategy is sort of, like I say, taking this middle ground of not antagonizing Trump, but not just giving in. And I suppose the hope is that if he holds firm, remains polite, but doesn't just accept these tariffs, keeps pushing for talks, maybe there'll be pressure on Trump domestically to come to a longer term solution, rather than pushing out global tariffs on all these countries. And if they can just not upset Trump too much, hold firm and not give in, eventually perhaps they'll come to the table and they can come to a more mutually beneficial arrangement. But he doesn't want to just give in like major concessions to Trump, basically. There's also been a bit of positive news in this respect to suggest that this approach might work, which is that Japan's chief negotiator, Kazuo Ryose, has pointed out that there's a reference point in that there's been recent talk of a UK-US trade deal, and he's basically citing that as an example of showing that in some situations the US is willing to lower tariffs by sector to some countries. And obviously the big one Japan will be hoping for is to get an exception for their auto tariffs. That Japan's car industry is so key, those exports are such a major part of their economy. They'll be hoping to have no new tariffs on that industry in particular, and they're pointing to this UK-US potential trade deal as like a positive. And I suppose they'll be making the argument that, okay, yes, there's the special relationship between the UK and the USA, but you could also make the argument that Japan is a key ally for the USA, and there's long-standing security and trade ties between the two countries, and they should view them equally as having a close relationship and being a key ally. So if you'll do it for the UK, why won't you do it for Japan? And there's this precedent potentially that they can point to in the ongoing discussions that they might have with the USA. So that's a bit of an encouragement there as well. And so we'll just have to see how this all shakes out. But essentially, Ishiba does not want to make any major concessions to Trump, but he's just trying to be like I say, hold this middle ground of not antagonizing and not accepting these new tariffs. And so we'll have to see how that works out for him. And if this, tough talk of Japan won't accept any new tariffs and 10% isn't good enough, we'll have to see how that works out in the long run. Now, the second issue where Ishiba is talking tough is where it comes to the consumption tax, which affects Japanese citizens. Now, I believe this is similar to sort of VAT in the UK, a tax you pay on purchases. Now, there's a lot of pressure on Ishiba at the minute. He's gone through recently the gift scandal. He's leading minority government to begin with. He's having to cut deal with parties just to get legislation through. And now he's coming up to these July elections, and there's a lot of pressure on Ishiba. So he might be tempted, in a weak position to just sort of throw concessions at the public to try and boost his image, make people like him. People always like tax cuts and concessions, and they, it might be fiscally irresponsible perhaps, but to get the economy going, to make people feel good and to make people like the LDP. But he's talking tough in the sense that he's refusing to contemplate that, and he's specifically called out parties who are proposing to lower consumption tax. One example of a party that's doing that recently is, I believe, the JCP chairman has said he'd want to look at lowering the consumption tax to 5% with an eye to potentially eliminating it altogether. I don't believe the JCP are the only party looking to do that. But Ishiba is very much against this, and he's taken a bit of a sideswipe at populists, sort of people from the centre and left who are sort of promising lower taxes to Japanese people, and also arguably to people on his right, people like the Conservative Party of Japan, Sanzito, who might see themselves as more sort of libertarian, lower tax parties. He's taken a swipe at all of them, all of the populist parties in a sense, by saying that things are doomed when politicians say what people want to hear. And I suppose he's sort of pitching himself and the LDP as sort of the long-standing, sensible party of government. We're going to, keep things stable. We're not just going to throw out radical solutions just to make people happy, if it's not in Japan's fiscal and long-term interest. And so he's sort of not giving into pressure to sort of throw out these concessions, and we'll have to see how that goes down. The LDP, I believe, is doing a little bit poorly at the moment in the polls, and they're facing threats from other parties looking ahead to the July elections. But we'll have to see if Ishiba, refusing to give in after the gift scandal, holding on, keeping hold of the reins of his party and not just panicking and giving away lots of concessions, and pitching himself as sort of the continuity, sensible person of government, whether that will work in the long run. But in that sense, he's talking tough and not just panicking and giving away lots of concessions just to get like a positive outcome immediately. There's been an interesting story recently in regards to immigration. That's always a sort of a big issue in Japan, and in particular the question, does Japan need more regional immigration, or does the regions of Japan, and the situation of course with Japan is that generally the Japanese population is declining as they're struggling with a low birth rate, but Tokyo, I believe, is still growing, and that's because of the dominance of Tokyo, and that's where all the jobs are, that's where the house building is, and that's where everyone wants to move, that's where the economy is really going. And so that's effectively having a bit of a drain effect on the regions as people are moving out of the regions of Japan to Tokyo, as well as obviously people not being born at the same rate they used to be. That's causing a decline in regional populations, I believe. Now, this comes up because I believe the governor of Miyagi has said that the key for growth is to sort of regions to be competitive and attractive for foreign people moving in. That's how you're going to address long-term labour shortages, skills shortages, and get the economies in regions moving, and sort of avoid things sort of falling apart as the population falls and you're not able to have enough key workers come in to fill all the industries you have in the regional economies. And he says that is key for local municipalities. So effectively, that's what you have to do. And it's interesting because this sort of contrasts a little bit with what Ishiba has said, because Ishiba has said that regionalism is key if you want to get the Japanese population growing again. He's really targeting the idea of growing regions of Japan in the hope that people can start having children sort of outside of Tokyo. If you can perhaps build up local regional economies, create jobs there make them attractive, and that's where there's additional space to grow, because as I say, there's been this drain towards people moving towards Tokyo, so there's more housing in the regional areas, there's more room to grow. That there's perhaps a hope in Ishiba's eyes of regionalism being the key to getting the population growing again and building up Japan that way. And I suppose these two aren't mutually exclusive. If you were to do something to build up local industries, I believe there's been talk of building up chip production in Japan and having that as like a sort of a regional industry that could get jobs growing in regional areas and get people moving in. Or you could look to do something like what the UK has talked about in the past with like sort of these free port, low tax zones. So if they were to make regional areas very attractive for business, perhaps you could have sort of key foreign workers coming in with skills to build up industry, and then also have Japanese people moving back to work in those industries as well. And maybe those two visions of Ishiba's regionalism, as well as what this governor is talking about, into having key foreign workers come in to build up industry and fill shortage gaps, maybe those could work hand in hand. But it's interesting that Ishiba's talking about regionalism being the key for population growth, arresting the decline of the Japanese population, whereas this governor's talking about the key being to get regional areas attractive for foreign workers. Now perhaps those could work together, and we'll have to see what happens there in the long term, but it's quite an interesting whether these approaches are contrasting or whether they could possibly work together. And I believe the reason the governor's saying this is essentially that I believe that lots of foreign workers go to like the cities. That's where the draw is. That's where lots of the jobs are. And he's essentially saying that they have to be competitive if they want to fill the labour shortages that there are in regional areas. If you want to build up regional industry, you have to get foreign workers in. So you have to sort of attract them and give them a reason to move to regional areas rather than just moving to the cities. And I believe he gave like a fairly in-depth response. He talked about possibly financial incentives, and he also talked about sort of being attractive, marketing regions as being like sort of friendly to different cultures as a possible way to draw people in, rather than just everyone moving to the cities and just the population of the cities going up while regions continue to suffer and have these skill gaps. And he's essentially saying that creating a situation where they can settle in the long term for the regions is essential, really, for these sort of local municipalities. Otherwise, they're going to face problems just to keep their infrastructure running and declining industries, that sort of thing. So it'd be interesting to see if that approach is something that different regions go for in the long run, and if that could work hand in hand with Ishiba's regionalism approach, or if they will focus more on, as I say, Ishiba's approach of encouraging Japanese people to move back out to the regions more. There's been also a couple of news stories relating to sort of intrigue around leadership. I mentioned previously the possibility of there being some sort of merger. Now, this was essentially just paper talk combined with some polling that suggested that the DPFP leader, a party which grew in the last election, and perhaps they could come in, merge with the LDP and have some sort of coalition, and the DPFP leader, despite being the minority, could be the new prime minister, was something that was sort of floated as sort of paper talk. Well, that's perhaps gained a little bit more ground, because the ex-prime minister Kishida Fumio has come out and said that it's perhaps something that should be discussed. He said essentially that Tamaki Yuichiro is one candidate for prime minister when considering a number of public opinion polls. Now, that's really given a bit of life to the story, because previously this was just something that was like insider speculation, and there was polls suggesting that he was possibly a favourable candidate for among different people to be the prime minister, leading the LDP and his own party in some sort of coalition. But the fact that he's addressed it has really put a bit of life into it. Now, it could be he's just thinking out loud. Obviously, as an ex-prime minister, he's a very prominent figure. But it's interesting to think, is he just thinking out loud, as I say, on his own account? Is there a faction within the LDP that wants this, and he's effectively acting as a spokesman, or does he feel that this is out there as a story, so he has to commentate it on some reason? But it certainly lent a little bit of extra legitimacy, a little bit more potency to the idea that this could be a serious prospect, the fact that he's commentated on it. And so that's something that's very interesting to think about. We'll have to see what happens, as I say, going into July in these elections. Adding a bit more pressure on Ishiba, the CDP leader, the Constitution Party leader, and these are the second most large party, the biggest opposition party after the LDP. They have said that there's a great possibility that there could be an election in the lower house at the same time as the upper house election that's coming in July, which is quite dramatic. That's suggesting that essentially they're going to no confidence Ishiba. Now, I believe that's pretty much the only way to call an election, unless Ishiba were to call one of his own accord, or perhaps the LDP were to install a new leader and they were to call an election immediately, which would be quite dramatic. It's certainly not something that the LDP would want to do, I think, given that the polls are not looking good for them. They're likely to take some losses in the upper house election. So essentially, it looks like the only way to cause a lower house election at the same time would be to have a vote of no confidence and to force one. Now, it could be that the leaders essentially of the CDP is just needling Ishiba and putting the pressure on by saying this, because it would be very difficult to pull off. Although the LDP is a minority government, they're in a position potentially to block it unless a lot of parties coordinate together, which would be quite hard to pull off because there's differing views about whether it's good to have Ishiba go, or whether, as he's suffering from the gift scandal, whether it's better to, have him there as a sort of a weaker leader rather than having someone new in and forcing a new election. And it's also relatively soon after the last election. So it could just be him needling Ishiba and putting the pressure on, or perhaps he's very serious about this. But we're closing in on July now, so we'll have to monitor that and see how that goes. But that would be quite extraordinary if they were to have an election at the same time, and it would be very dramatic. And goodness knows what would happen. I mean, possibly some sort of coalition between multiple parties. Maybe the LDP could just hang on if that were to happen. I mean, it's just pure speculation, and it would be very chaotic if that were to suddenly happen. Another factor in this is I've just talked about the DPFP being touted by an ex-Prime Minister, of an LDP member no less, as a possible leader of a coalition between the DPFP and LDP. Now, surely, given the fact that LDP is in a minority government and that essentially nearly all the other parties, I think, would have to club together to vote them out, would the DPFP go along with that if he's possibly thinks there's a serious prospect of him being a prime minister of a coalition? Who can say? It depends how susceptible to this idea he is, whether this talk is something that he's in favour of or not. You can imagine you very much would like the idea, if you've never been prime minister, and if you've been in, and his party's been in the shadow of the LDP, leading it and taking the front seat. But yeah, it's interesting to think whether he would, if he's really got his eye on the prize, and therefore he's not going to want to accept the LDP too much, he's not going to want to upset them by forcing out the current leader. If he's the one forcing Ishiba out, will the party really want to go along with that? It's going to be pretty difficult for them optically if the DPFP possibly vote out Ishiba and then he just attempts to become the leader of the LDP and the DPFP. Or perhaps the DPFP might think more of a longer term view, we want to increase our seat share, rather than just having their leader come in as prime minister and have to prop up the LDP. Maybe they like the idea of forcing the election now when Ishiba's weak and gaining extra seats for themselves in both an upper and lower house election. So it'd be interesting to think about what the DPFP want in that sense and where their priorities are. So we'll have to just wait and see, or perhaps this is all just paper talk. But that's interesting to think about and speculate on. Now, we've talked in the past about the rice crisis in Japan, and that's caused by a shortfall in the production of rice, and as a result, there's not enough rice hitting the shelves in Japan, and there's been a bit of a shortage, and that's causing higher prices. Now, the government response to this was to release their stockpiles and to try and increase supply and then decrease prices, of course. I've seen a lot of stories about this, that effectively the problem has not really got that much better. And recently there's been an update from an agricultural co-op, and they're saying that only 32% of the stockpiled government-issued rice has actually, been put into production. Only 32% of the stockpiled rice is actually going out there and is available to consumers to decrease the prices, which would explain why possibly this is still an ongoing issue, that the stockpile has not fully been released. And it could just be it's difficult logistically, or who knows, but this just shows that the government action has not quite been effective enough yet, and that partly goes to why this is an ongoing crisis, and this rice problem is just not going away for the government. However, having said that, there are two pieces of good news for the government I'd like to cover. One is that per the health ministry, I've talked in the past about the ongoing birth problems of Japan's facing and their falling population, and they've come up with another measures they're discussing regionally and nationally. Things like helping with childcare, that sort of thing, and sort of looking at reforming the working week is something they've also done. But the newest measure is that to eliminate the cost associated with having children, from 2026 they're looking at fully covering the cost of childbirth. So the government will take the cost of having a child off couples' hands from 2026 is something that's being looked at. Now, I don't think it's necessarily as simple as people have put off having children because of the associated cost. I think things like housing, the amount of people in relationships, people's priorities, work-life balance. There's numerous issues that are factoring into people. Cultural issues, things that are hard to quantify as well. But there's many issues that are causing this situation. So I don't think it's as simple as people are being put off by the cost. And so we'll have to see how smoothly that comes in 2026 and if that will have any sort of impact. But that's an example of a measure that the government are putting through and they can point to and say, we've done this to try and address this situation. So in that sense, it's good news. And it's also, of course, if you're starting a family, it's nice not to have to worry about the associated cost and paying bills. So, that's a very positive story on a personal level for families who are having children in Japan. So that is a positive, of course. A second news is that there's a surplus being reported in Japan. I believe this is not a government surplus necessarily, but this is tied to the amount that is being made in Japan through foreign investments and through exports versus the amount that Japan is spending on imports coming in. And that's being fueled by a good return on foreign investments, and as well as the fact that there's a weak yen. That means that exports are more attractive. And I'm not sure if this is for fiscal 2024, so I'm not sure how much the Trump tariffs have impacted on this or not. And it'd be interesting to think about that in the long term. But at the moment, I believe there's something like a 30.38 trillion yen surplus in this sense. So of all this, doom and gloom, things like the difficulties facing Japan at the moment, it's nice to think that there is this one sense where things are fiscally quite good for Japan, and they're having this effectively surplus. And of course, the weak yen has had positives in terms of tourism, of course, which is a big industry for Japan. So you might think of the weak yen as a negative, but there are some knock-on positive effects, of course. I'm no economist, but that seems like a bit of good news, at least in one sense. But that really rounds out the show, guys. That sums up the recent political news in Japan. Thank you so much for listening. I'm your host, Luke Whitaker. Sayonara, goodbye.